In an era when college students are more diverse than ever, we hear a lot in higher education about the importance of creating inclusive learning environments. Many articles have been written and presentations given about strategies faculty can employ to create a classroom environment conducive to learning for all of our students. But what do students have to say about what they believe to be most helpful? What do they report are some things we do in class that foster exclusion? Given the wide range of diversity in its many forms, how can we as educators consider all of the many backgrounds, experiences, perspectives, and considerations, both visible and invisible, that our students bring to our learning spaces? Welcome to Teach Well, Learn Well, a podcast series highlighting the scholarship being published by members of the University of Tennessee Health Science Center's community about effective ways to teach. I'm Tom Lochner of UTHSE's Teaching and Learning Center. Each month, we interview members of our faculty about their research and its impact on the higher education community. Today, in our inaugural episode, we talk to Dr. Pamela Lewis Kipkulei, Associate Professor in the College of Health Professions, Dr. Kelly Jo Fulkerson Dikuua, Instructional Consultant in the Teaching and Learning Center. They've written an article titled "When They Are Real with Us, Student Perceptions of Inclusive Teaching and Learning Practices." They interviewed dozens of students to better understand their perspectives on this important question of how to create inclusive learning environments. Pam, this first question's for you. Lots has been published about ways to create inclusive learning environments, but there's not a lot written about the student perspective. Why do you think that is?
I think as educators, we think that we're being student-centered, whatever we are, with whatever we're doing in the classroom. But I think that we're typically doing it from a faculty lens. So we think that, what we think is best for the students, they're going to think that's best for them because it's what their professors think. And I think that we forget sometimes to ask them what it is that they think and what it is that they want. So their perspective doesn't always get included when we are constructing our classroom environment.
Kelly Jo, the key question from your paper is, what practices do students perceive as inclusive? What surprised you most about the responses that you got?
So the thing that surprised me the most was definitely, I don't know that it surprised me, but it definitely jumped out to me. So we asked students about teaching strategies that made them feel most included and climate building strategies that made them feel most included. And out of all of the categories, the thing that was rated the highest was praise and positive reinforcement. 83% of respondents said that that is what made them feel included. And it didn't surprise me that students appreciate that, but I had no idea that it would be such a high number of participants who rated that way.
And it's really easy to do, isn't it? When you're asking a question and getting a response from your students.
Yes, and I think as educators, it's hard because we're always trying to find that balance between giving praise and positive reinforcement, but also giving constructive feedback. So it leaves a lot to think about. How do we give that praise and positive reinforcement, but also, ensure that we are giving them the feedback they need to grow and develop?
Unless they really make an effort, faculty don't typically have much insight into who their students are. I noticed in your paper that you have comments such as, I have a learning disability. I do not have reliable internet. I don't have access to technology needed to complete the work. I face food insecurity. I face housing insecurity. I need multiple or varied approaches to learning. English is not my first language. I'm a first-generation college student. I have caregiving responsibilities for children or adult relatives. My guess is that most faculty have no idea that their students have these issues facing them. How does having this personal information about their students help them to be better teachers?
I think when we have that information, it helps us be better teachers because we can kind of cater more to the needs of our students. So if I know that you don't have internet and I'm thinking, reliable internet, and I'm thinking about doing a group project, I can definitely pair you with someone who has the internet capabilities that you're going to need for that project. So then you're not left out of the learning process. But also, I think that having that information, when in my classes, I think about, my students, if I know who you are and kind of how you relate to things, then when I bring in guest speakers, when I bring in things such as that, I'm making sure that I'm bringing in somebody who everybody in the classroom can relate to. So if I know that, I have a whole bunch of Hispanic students who don't have like the best experiences, I can bring in someone who they can relate to so that they learn from that person. So it kind of informs a lot about my teaching and what I'm doing in the classroom, when I have that information. So therefore, I think it makes me a better teacher because I'm ensuring that they're learning from people who kind of look like them and who they can relate to.
I know some faculty, though, who believe it's inappropriate to get to know students on that kind of personal level, that there should be a separation of them as a teacher and them as a person. But data from your paper indicates otherwise. Is there a balance that we need to strike?
Yeah, I think this ties really beautifully into what Pam was saying. Getting to know our students personally doesn't mean we have to know, their second cousin's middle name or what they did over the weekend, which is not necessarily something that I really want to know about my students. But I think definitely getting to know them as people in terms of like, I work two jobs because I'm trying to support my family, or I carry an EpiPen and I have a deadly allergy to something, or things like that can be really useful as an educator, whether it's thinking about safety in the classroom or clinical setting, but also informing how we teach. So, Tom, you had mentioned some of those things that we asked, and students did indicate some of them don't have access to Wi-Fi or reliable technology. And knowing that can just help us to say, hey, I'll help you find this on campus, or this is the assignment I'm giving. You will need access to Wi-Fi to work on it at home. Let's brainstorm other, places you can get it. And I think too, a lot of it really comes down to individual instructors and kind of what you want your teaching persona to be. Like, I know myself, I tend to be chatty and I'll share a lot with my students, they'll know my dog's name and things like that. But that doesn't have to be everyone. I don't think everyone has to do that. But I think just being open to get to know them in ways that support their learning and creating that supported learning environment can help.
Common theme I've heard, especially since coming to UTHSC from talking to faculty and students, is their connection with what I call the humanity of teaching. And some of the things that both of you have talked about is the importance of us not being just sort of the sage on the stage and the expert that comes into the space, but getting to know people as humans. And students I hear every year talk about how important that is. You reference that in your paper when you're talking about faculty that stating something like they're having a bad day or they've made a mistake. Why do you believe that's important? And does admitting that humanity take away from faculty credibility and standing?
When I first became a teacher, I think I was that kind of sage on the stage. And I noticed that a lot of times my students did not relate to me. I was like this person who just kind of gave them things to do, and I don't think they related to me very well. And when I started to be a little bit more human and talk with them and laugh with them and admit that, hey, I made a mistake. So anyone who wrote this, bring your paper back to me and I'm going to give you the credit for it because that was my mistake, not you all's mistake. I started noticing that my students, related to me better. And just kind of on a personal note, I'm a diabetic. And one of the first things I tell my students is that I'm a diabetic. I tell them where my candy stash is so that as a human, they know if I start to repeat myself or to look funny, hey, get my candy stash. And actually, once in class, as the students had to get my candy stash and help me. And I think that made them, then when they came in class the next day and they were relating to me more, all my students had candy in their purses. So I think that when I showed them that I'm human and that I can make mistakes and that I have some of the same issues that they have, they relate to me better. And I think that learning tends to be very relational. So if they're relating better to me, then I think they're going to learn better from me.
I was surprised by the high number of students who indicated active learning strategies made them feel more included. I hear complaints all the time from faculty who say their students hate active learning and don't want them to do it. So there's a disconnect there between what I've heard in my limited experience and what you saw in your research. What's that disconnect?
Yeah, that is such a great question, Tom. And Pam and I actually talked about that a lot when we saw our results, because I've gotten that pushback from students. Pam, I don't know if you've gotten it from students about active learning, like it's only
Some, not as
yeah,
much as
some.
I thought I'd get.
Yeah, but sometimes, yeah, no, but definitely like too much active learning, or I'm tired of turning and talking to my neighbor. I've gotten that on evals before. But when we kind of dug deep into that in the research we did, what we saw is that students definitely found a lot of active learning strategies to be inclusive, especially small group ones like case-based learning, team-based learning, problem-based learning, small group discussions, and interactive lecturing was another one they ranked really highly. But it was in the qualitative responses, they qualified it, I guess, by saying things like, well, I like group discussions when they're well structured, or I like this type of learning when I know why we're doing it. So I think definitely using, being purposeful in it, telling students your why you're doing it, and then putting it together carefully can help it to feel purposeful and inclusive rather than kind of an added on thing or something like that.
What is it about active learning that makes students believe that that's an inclusive environment?
So, yeah, another great question. They said a lot of things like through active learning. Well, they didn't say necessarily through active learning, but in, case-based learning, it gave me a chance to talk, or it gave me a chance to be heard. Or a lot of them wrote things like, I felt so much more comfortable sharing my opinion with my neighbor before talking with the whole class. So I think just giving them a chance to think and to think with their peers and those kind of near peer educators before having talked to the big group really helped. And I think also, sorry, I don't mean to keep going on. I think also they talked about being put into groups helped them, because some of the students mentioned being maybe shyer or more introverted. And so when they were put into groups and given something concrete to do in those groups, it was easier for them to bridge gaps and make connections with their peers that they may not have made otherwise.
Your paper lists practices that students perceive to be inclusive. Do you believe these practices have changed over time? I'm thinking specifically of what one speaker I've heard say, the before times, before COVID, and how students' expectations have changed. So do you think that these practices have changed over time? Will they continue to evolve? And if so, how do we keep up with it?
That's a good question. And yes, I think the practices have evolved over time. And I think a lot of that has to do with technology. As we
Hmm.
gain more technology, our students are able, to do more of the active things, Google Docs, where, we don't have to be present all together in the same group, but we can be working on the same paper, or just different technologies means that they do things, they can do way more than what they did for those technologies existed. And I think that with the all of the technological advances and how they're happening every day, we're going to continue to have technologies that we can incorporate into the classroom, and our students are going to be able to use them. A lot of times they know about them way before I do, and they're teaching me the technologies, and I'm teaching them how to use it educationally. So I think a lot of that will continue to happen. And I think that as educators, we're going to have to keep up with it. And I know one of the ways that I've been keeping up with it is I take lots of classes through the Teaching and Learning Center. I do the medallions that they offer, because that really helps me to make sure that I'm keeping up with the learning, because technology is not going away. And if it can help in the classroom, then we need to know how to use it.
Thank you for the plug for the Teaching and Learning Center. But do you also think that student expectations of what it takes to be an inclusive learning environment have also changed?
I do believe that it has. I think sometimes though that students want you to be so inclusive that that sometimes they have unreal expectations about what inclusivity can look like, because they want you to know so much about them that they never feel excluded. And as an instructor, I can't always ensure that no one feels excluded, but when they tell me, I think this is something that excluded me, then I can work on making sure that that doesn't happen again. But I have to remind them sometimes that my intentions are never to be exclusive, that I always want them to feel included, but that takes effort on both our parts. I can't read their minds. I don't always know exactly what they want, but if you have a way that you can learn better and you want us to work on that in the classroom, I'm typically more than willing to try it. but I just want them to know that it may not be something that you enjoy, but if 95% of the students can learn from it, then we're going to try it. And then maybe the next time we'll try something that you like more.
That's interesting that you make an explicit statement that you're trying to be inclusive. You can't be inclusive all the time. You're going to try your hardest, but sometimes it's not going to necessarily be there for everybody.
Yeah. I think that they relate to me a little bit better when I say that, because then they realize, okay, she's trying. She's really trying to make sure that we get this.
And that sort of leads me to the next question. You may have already answered this in part, but you talk about extensively how inclusivity varies among students and what is inclusive for somebody is exclusive for somebody else. How can faculty navigate these differences? And I think you sort of talked about it. I don't know if you want to say anything more, basically just saying explicitly that this is going to vary depending on your perspective and who you are, and I'm trying my best. Anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah. I try very hard to give them choices. There's so many different active learning strategies out there. And if this works better, if half of my class learn better through group work and the other half don't, then, maybe this week we may do some stuff that has group work. And then the next week we may have a different choice where some of the other students who learn through team-based learning or through a different type of learning, we may incorporate that into the lesson the next week so that they have choices. And Kelly Jo and I were talking earlier, we don't really try to force choices on them. A lot of times I will give them options. You would like to do this assignment in a group, everyone can do it in a group, or if you'd like to do it individually, we can do it individually. Or I might ask them, what do you think? We can do this many different ways. What do you think? So I give them some choices. That way, everybody has a little bit of input. And I think that if they have that input, they're, again, relating to it better, and it helps them in the learning process.
One of the interesting things is, especially at a place like this, is that some of our classes are very big, classes of 150, 175 students. Some of the recommendations that you make in your paper, I could see being really easy in smaller classes and intimate settings. But what about where you have, the large cohorts in a lecture hall? How do you practice these inclusive strategies in large classes?
I think large classes can be really challenging when it comes to bringing in a lot of inclusive practices. For example, one thing that we found was being called by name is really important to students, and for you to know their name and their pronouns. And if you have 25 students, that can be a little bit easier than if you have 85 students or 120 students, or you only see them 3 times a semester. So I think in large classes, you really do have to be intentional about choosing what you can and can't do. And so, for example, if it's important to you as an educator to get to know their names, printing out that roster with the pictures on it and taking it with you. Pam was telling me how sometimes she'll take it, and if the student doesn't look like that, she makes like a little note on the paper. Using those name tints where you have them write their names and put them out each class period so you can call them by name. And I think also just telling them like, hey, I really want to learn all of your names. It's really important to me, but I'm going to call you the wrong name at some point. Please correct me. Just making that really clear that it's important to you. And I think that while large classes can present challenges, there are a lot of things you can do in big classes that are harder in smaller classes. So in big classes, for example, you can do a lot more group work because you have more students. You can split them into more groups. You can vary your student groups a lot more. You can do different types of games that you can't always do in smaller group settings. So I think it's just finding those things that work and really going back to your own priorities as an educator and what you want to do with that.
It's interesting in your comments, Kelly Jo, you mentioned again the humanity of teaching is that admitting that you're going to make mistakes. You might get somebody's name wrong. You might get their pronouns wrong. You might mispronounce their names, but that you're trying really hard in order to correct those over time.
Yeah, and I think it's hard. I taught for a long time outside of the United States, and it was very difficult for me to learn my students' names just because they weren't names that I had grown up around culturally. And so I think that really opened my eyes to having to admit those moments. But also, maybe if it's a faculty member who isn't from the United States and isn't as familiar with the names or pronunciations, just seem that clear to your students as well, or something like that.
I love the phrase in your, I don't know if you coined this or if you used this before, but I love your phrase, facilitating a culture of grace. How did you come up with that term, and what are some practical things that we can do to create this culture of grace?
Yeah, that was probably my favorite part from the paper too, Pam. I don't know about you, but
Yes,
yeah,
definitely.
we had a lot of discussions around that idea of facilitating a culture of grace. The reason that we came to that was because we kept reading suggestions and comments and feedback from students. And I'll be honest, at times I got a little bit overwhelmed as an educator, thinking, I can't do all of this. I want all of my students to feel included, but there's just things that I know I'm going to fall short on or I can't do. But a lot of the fears that the students voiced and a lot of things that they talked about as making them feel excluded was rooted in fears of making mistakes and being scared of messing up or missing a deadline or whatever it is, or just wanting their professors or their instructors to understand that they're going to make mistakes and to have space to make those. So that's really where we came up with that phrase, is thinking about how do we create a learning environment where we can all make mistakes at times. We can all figure out ways to correct those, but really erring on the side of kindness and not jumping to think, oh, this person is intentionally messing up, or this is always how they are, or anything like that, and just giving them a chance to grow and develop.
And that culture of grace works both ways, right? So perhaps if we're showing that culture of grace to our students, that perhaps they'll also show some grace to us.
Exactly.
None of
Yes.
us are perfect.
I think that was the big idea with it, is that not only do they need grace, but we need grace as well. And if we all see the humanity in each other, then the learning environment is going to be much more positive. If we can just all look at each other and know that everybody makes mistakes, and if we realize that, then the learning can occur. So
I love that. That's perfect. So you've written this paper. It's a wonderful paper. It has some really good insight. But as you come out of it, what are some unanswered questions you have after writing this, and what are your next steps?
So as we were looking at our data, we were looking at the fact that this is how students feel. And we were thinking, as professors, I wonder how they feel about the fact that students think we think this is great, but students don't think it's great. So we started thinking about, there's a gap in some of the knowledge about how students perceive things and how instructors perceive things. So we are going to do a study where we're going to look at our professors, the instructors in the classroom, and say, hey, the students feel this. How do you respond to that? What do you think about it? And if your students feel like this, how can we all get on the same page? So we're looking at having some faculty focus groups where we talk to them and we share some of the things that students told us about what they feel makes them feel excluded and included, and give faculty a chance to react to it, and then look at their reactions and maybe figure out how we can bridge the gap between the two different perspectives.
Great. I look forward to seeing that paper. Pam and Kelly Jo, thank you very much. This is a great discussion. And again, that phrase, facilitating a culture of grace, I think is my biggest takeaway from this paper. And just again, the notion that it's important what students think. And this is a great insight into how do we make an inclusive environment that is useful for the students and what the students have to say about it. So thank you for your time, and thank you again.
Thanks for
You're
having
welcome.
us.
And that's our first episode of Teach Well, Learn Well. Thank you to Dr. Pamela Lewis Kipkulei and Dr. Kelly Jo Fulkerson Dikuua for their great insight into what students believe to be inclusive learning strategies. I'm Tom Lochner of the Teach Well Learning Center at the University of Tennessee Health Science Center. Until next time,